The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Restaurants Canada webinar, Foodservice Facts, the Next Normal. My name is Roberto Sarju, Director of Marketing and Communications here at Restaurants Canada, and I'll be your moderator today. Foodservice Facts is Restaurants Canada's flagship research publication. And given the devastating impact COVID-19 is having on Canada's food service industry, this edition is the most important we've ever done, and it'll help you make informed decisions as your business negotiates the challenging road ahead. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Restaurants Canada's very own senior economist, Chris Elliott. You may have seen him from other webinars, Foodservice Facts, as well as at the RC Show Leadership Conference. Before we get started today, I just want to let you know that you can submit your questions by typing into the questions area of the control panel. You may send your question at any time during this presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available in a few days, and participants will be sent a link to the webpage. Finally, if you'd like to follow along online, we are live tweeting on Twitter at RestaurantsCA, and of course, you can catch our Instagram stories at Restaurants Canada. With that said, I'd like to hand it over to Chris to kick us off. Chris.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and good afternoon. I hope everyone on the call today is keeping safe and well. We seem to be running out of words to describe the impact that COVID-19 has had on Canada's food service industry. We've used words like devastating, unprecedented, and even called it carnage. And yet those words don't fully capture the damage done to our industry. I've spoken to restaurant operators that have been in the industry for more than 4 decades, and they've never experienced anything like this before. And many of those restaurant operators are really worried that they won't survive this. So in today's webinar, I'll review the impact that COVID-19 is having on the food service industry, how food service operators are pivoting to this new normal, and what the outlook is for the future. For today's presentation, I'll be pulling data from the 2020 Food Service Facts, but because the situation is evolving so rapidly, I will also include data from our most recent food service operator surveys, a consumer survey Restaurants Canada conducted with Angus Reid, as well as an updated forecast for food service sales for the remainder of 2020 through to 2022. Before we dive into today's presentation, I'd like to take a moment to reminisce about the past. It's important to remind ourselves where the industry was before COVID-19 hit. In the last decade, the restaurant industry was the fastest growing major industry in Canada, faster than many other high-profile industries such as retail trade, oil and gas, construction, manufacturing. At the end of 2019, we had grown to $93 billion in sales, which is more than double in size compared to 2000. And before COVID-19, we were on track to surpass $100 billion in sales in 2021. How quickly things have changed from where we were, where we are right now, and what could have been. It's important to note that even though we were experiencing strong aggregate sales growth, it was a different story at the operator level. In recent years, the average unit volume for restaurants had slowed from more than 2% real growth in 2016 and 2017 to a slight decline in 2018, followed by a modest increase in 2019. This is largely due to higher menu prices, a slowdown in customer traffic, and a much more competitive landscape. And while nominal sales increased over this time frame, there was a corresponding increase in operating costs. So we looked ahead to 2020 with optimism and really the hope that this would be our best year yet, just like it says right on the cover of this 2020 Daily Planner. Of course, we all know how things turned out, and by the middle of April, we were pretty much throwing these daily planners out the window. Now, if you were part of last year's Food Service Facts webinar, you may remember I used the analogy of being in a survival situation, where running a restaurant is a lot like being lost in the wilderness. Well, this year is also a survival situation. But instead of being lost, the food service industry basically fell off a cliff, and I would say broke both legs. And that cliff is food service sales. In February 2020, monthly food service sales were a record $6.3 billion once adjusted for seasonality. By the end of April, sales had fallen to just $2.4 billion. This is the lowest monthly sales in more than 2 decades. So COVID-19 basically erased 2 decades of growth in just 2 months. So not only is this a survival situation, this is a rescue operation. And no province was unscathed. We recorded record sales declines across the country. We saw year-over-year declines of 50% in Prince Edward Island, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, and declines of more than 60% in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, as these had higher number of cases. Not all segments were impacted equally, however. Quick service restaurant sales fell by 41% in April, as they relied heavily on takeout and delivery. In fact, nearly half of all sales at a quick service restaurant in April came from drive-thrus. For full-service restaurants and bars, the vast majority were temporarily closed or provided limited takeout and delivery. As a result, sales at full-service restaurants plummeted by 78%, and bars were down a shocking 91%. In fact, on-premise orders at all restaurants dropped to just 4% of total sales in April, after accounting for more than half of total industry sales in 2019. According to data from Angus Reid, prior to COVID-19, 51% of Canadians visited a quick service restaurant at least once a week, and 31% visited a table service restaurant. In the past 4 months, so from May through to August, those numbers fell to 35% at quick service restaurants and just 14% at table service restaurants. This decline represents millions and millions of lost opportunities for the food service industry and declines in terms of sales. As a result of the dramatic decline in sales, that restaurant and accommodation industry was the hardest hit of any industry when it came to job losses. Incredibly, employment in the food service industry plummeted to levels we haven't seen since the early 1980s. In April, 817,000 food service workers were either laid off or still employed but not working any hours. This represents 2/3 of the total 1.2 million employees. Now, in the past 4 months, employment in Canada's food service industry has regained 355,000 jobs from where it was in April. Yet, the food service industry has the farthest way to go to return to pre-COVID levels of any industry. In August, employment in the restaurant and hospitality industry was 260,000 jobs below pre-COVID levels in February. This represents by far the largest job loss gap of any industry. As a percentage of employment, food service and hospitality is 21% below pre-COVID-19 levels, while all other industries are down an average of about 5%. And in some cases, we even have a few industries that are just 1% below pre-COVID levels. Clearly, between the decline in sales and the steep job losses, the restaurant industry faces a long road to recovery. It has been devastating, it has been unprecedented, and definitely there's been a lot of carnage. If you've seen my presentations before, you know I love being outdoors and kayaking in the wilderness. In the presentation for the Foodservice Facts last year, I walked through the 3 zones of assessment on how to analyze your food service business and come up with the best course of action to get through any challenge. Unfortunately, we're once again in this dreadful survival situation, but rather than repeat last year's analysis, I thought I'd pivot a little bit and go with a slightly different approach this year. So for today's webinar, I'll apply 4 wilderness survival guidelines from survival experts as a metaphor for what's happening in our industry. And these are, what is your first priority? What's in your survival kit? What is your food situation? And stay warm and dry. We have to be clear, there is no playbook for a situation like COVID-19, but I'll use these survival guidelines as a general theme throughout the rest of today's presentation to get you thinking about your business and how to respond and adapt. So let's begin with, what is your first priority? In the wilderness, generally speaking, it's water. You can go for a few weeks with very little food, but can only survive a couple of days if you don't have enough water. Similarly, a business can only go so long without bringing in any money. Your first priority for a restaurant, besides the health and safety of your guests and staff, is liquidity and cash flow, because without cash coming in, your business won't survive. According to a study by JP Morgan Chase in 2015, the average restaurant in the United States can go just 16 days without bringing in any money before it is forced to go out of business. By way of comparison, the median small business has an average of 27 buffer days. So I haven't seen any data like this in Canada, but I would suspect that it's a very similar story. And it's largely because we're such a labor-intensive industry. What this does show is how fragile the financial situation is for food service operators. And this was even before COVID-19. Throughout this crisis, one of the biggest challenges is operators not having enough money to pay rent, vendors, business taxes, and make payroll. This is because nearly all restaurants are seeing lower same-store sales relative to last year. This chart shows the percentage of operators that reported higher, lower, or flat same-store sales on a year-over-year basis. Even in the first 2 weeks of February, 40% of respondents reported lower same-store sales, outnumbering those with higher sales. And worse, this was a continuation of the trend we saw throughout 2019, and is largely due to rising menu prices and high household debt. By the end of March, a stunning 96% of restaurants reported lower same-store sales as social distancing measures were implemented across the country. And even though the number of confirmed 19 cases declined during the summer and we had warmer weather and it was a nice patio season, still 90% of restaurants reported lower same-store sales in July and August. So has there been any improvement in food service sales since April? So this chart shows the decline in seasonally adjusted food service sales compared to pre-COVID levels in February. So these are not year-over-year growth rates, but just how the industry performed relative to February 2020. For example, in April, sales were down 63% compared to pre-COVID levels. In May, the decline was 51%, and as of July, the most recent month we have available, sales were down 27%. By segment, quick service restaurants have seen the fastest recovery, as sales were down 13% in July compared to February. Meanwhile, sales at full service restaurants are still down 34%, and bars are down a shocking 50%. Now, by way of comparison, overall retail sales, the blue line, have actually returned to pre-COVID-19 levels in June, and in July were even 1% above February 2020 levels. As you remember, grocery stores saw a huge spike in April, and in July remained 7% above February 2020 levels. So these different trajectories in sales are driven by consumer perceptions about these various channels and venues. In a study that we just conducted in mid-September by Angus Reid for Restaurants Canada, we see which venues Canadians are most comfortable and least comfortable visiting. At the top, 95% of Canadians are comfortable going out to a grocery store, and 86% said they would be comfortable visiting a bricks and mortar retail store. In contrast, 72% of Canadians are comfortable visiting restaurants, and 28% said, you know what, I'm going to avoid them. There are some interesting regional differences, however. In the prairies in Atlantic Canada, just 20% said that they would avoid restaurants, versus more than 30% in Ontario and Quebec. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the number of cases that exist in those areas. But the positive thing is we've still seen a steady increase in the share that feel comfortable going out to restaurants over the past 5 months. Back in August, just a few weeks ago, when we had the survey done, 66% of Canadians were comfortable visiting restaurants. So we've seen a 6-point jump in just a few weeks. If we go all the way back to April, only 26% of Canadians at that time were comfortable going out to a restaurant. So we have seen quite an improvement. And then finally at bars, not much to say other than about 75%, 3/4 of Canadians said that they would currently avoid them. Now again, these results were taken from a survey that was done a few weeks ago. And as you know, in this industry, and especially because of COVID, things can change very quickly. So given the increase in COVID-19 cases in several jurisdictions across Canada in recent weeks, we're probably going to see a bit of a pullback in the share of Canadians that are comfortable visiting restaurants and bars, at least temporarily. At this point, though, it's just too soon to tell how much of an impact this is going to have on the industry. The survey also looked more closely at the various restaurant channels. In mid-September, the vast majority of Canadians were very comfortable visiting a restaurant for off-premise transactions, with 94% saying that they would be comfortable visiting for takeout or delivery, and then another 88% saying that they would be very comfortable going through a drive-through. In the next tier, 76% would have or would dine on a patio at a full-service restaurant, and 66% would do the same at a quick-service restaurant. After that, 65% would dine indoors at a full-service restaurant, but just under half of Canadians would dine indoors at a quick-service restaurant. And then finally, 40% would eat in a food court or a mall, and just 25% would go to a bar. Now again, keeping in mind, these results were from mid-September, so the results may have changed due to the increase in cases in certain jurisdictions. But the big question is, with cooler weather and patios closing, will guests pivot to takeout and delivery, or will they dine indoors during the autumn? These survey results suggest Canadians may be apprehensive about dining indoors in the autumn, as they preferred patios to indoor during the summer. Our own survey of restaurant operators found that 67% of full-service restaurants are really worried about their sales in the autumn because of the closure of patios and guests not dining indoors. So clearly, having some form of takeout and delivery will be essential going forward in case there is another spike in COVID-19 cases. For the next two slides, I want to focus on one particular category, and that's that eating indoors at a traditional restaurant. So for those that are currently going out to eat at a traditional full-service restaurant, we asked what would convince them to dine out even more often. And it's great to see that 44% of those Canadians would go out more often in order to help and support their local restaurant. This is just fantastic to see. Perhaps your marketing as well can talk about that emotional connection with restaurants. As part of this survey, one of the things that people missed the most about going during the lockdown was going out to restaurants with friends and family. Now, one of the bigger challenges, though, is that 42% said they would go out more often, but we're going to have to wait until there's a vaccine. And this share rises to 50% or more in British Columbia and Ontario. So this is going to be a challenge. Nearly 4 in 10 would go out more often if they had more disposable income. In these uncertain times, people are worried about their household finances and job security, especially for young people. And then, of course, there's the health and safety. They just want to see more health and safety, never enough. It is important to note that from this survey, 87% of Canadians said restaurants are doing a good job keeping guests safe. And that's fantastic to hear. Still, it's an important reminder that you need to make all your health and safety measures obvious and visible to help reassure your guests. So what about the guests that currently don't want to go out? Well, not surprising, it's this perception of safety. Canadians are worried that staff or guests have COVID-19. They just don't feel comfortable in an indoor setting, or the other guests won't socially distance. So again, in any of your marketing, highlight what your food service operation is doing, which could potentially convince some of those to come back in. Again, nearly 4 in 10 are waiting for a vaccine, so this group may be harder to convince. And then we have 35 to 54-year-olds, which are the most budget conscious. So if your clientele is this group, maybe market deals and offer limited time offers to help bring them in. So with the decline in sales, plus still having to pay a number of operating expenses and fixed costs, 33% of quick service restaurants and 45% of full service restaurants were operating at a loss at the end of August. On a positive note, though, we are seeing an improvement compared to June. At the end of June, 51% of quick service restaurants were operating at a loss, and 65% of full service restaurants were operating at a loss. So a considerable improvement here. Nevertheless, we still have a sizable 25% of operators that are just breaking even. Of those that are operating at a loss, it will take 12 months or longer for the vast majority of quick service restaurants and full service restaurants to return to profitability. Unfortunately, for some operators, many of these businesses won't ever recover without additional support and will have to close down permanently. According to research by Angus Reid, 55% of Canadians are aware of a restaurant in their community that has permanently closed. With the increase in cases of COVID-19, restaurants are now being forced to shut down in several jurisdictions, and we can expect to see more restaurants close because of this. Already, we're estimating that roughly 10 to 12% of all restaurants have permanently closed due to COVID-19 as of the end of August. That's nearly 10,000 establishments. And even just on a personal note, I know many of my favorite restaurants that have permanently closed down due to COVID-19. And I'm going to miss it, and I know that everyone on the call is going to go and miss their favorite spots as well. So I want to wrap up this section with a few quick survival tips. Cash flow pays the bills and is a key indicator of a business's financial health. Therefore, it's vitally important to reduce costs as much as possible. If there's a time to practice running a lean business, now is that time. And I know we've been doing that throughout this crisis. But one way is to continue to work with your partners and find a way to reduce expenses. And it's certainly a lot easier to cut variable costs than fixed costs, so tackle those first. And literally cut anything that you don't need. And just remember, everyone else is in a tight spot too. Second, prioritize cash flow, such as offering exclusive discounts to existing customers. Offering the right discount at the right time with a compelling exclusive messaging will help you boost sales, generate cash, and promote customer loyalty. Just remember those budget-conscious 35 to 54-year-olds that I talked about earlier. And third, empower your team with transparency. Be transparent about your restaurant metrics and what you need to achieve those goals. It gives the entire business a shared sense of mission, as well as promotes teamwork. And you may even get some great ideas from your staff as well. So in this next session, what you need to know is what is in your survival kit. Because in any survival situation, you need to have a reliable survival kit. For restaurant operators, part of that kit includes federal government programs that offer financial assistance. This is not going to be enough, however, and you may need to rely on your own resourcefulness to adapt to this new normal. So we'll talk about all this in the next section. At the beginning of the presentation, I said this was a rescue operation. As a result, the federal government has come forward with several programs in order to help businesses. Of the 3 federal programs, the wage subsidy has been the most helpful according to our survey, with 85% of restaurant operators saying it was extremely or very useful to their business. 56% of operators said the Canadian Emergency Business Account was helpful to their business, although 16% said they did not apply for it. As for the rent subsidy program, opinions were much more mixed, with just 37% saying it was extremely or very helpful. In contrast, 20% said it was not helpful, and 37% said it was either not applicable to them or their landlord did not apply for it. A few weeks ago, it was announced that the wage subsidy program would be extended by the federal government until mid next year. So this is certainly great news to hear. And hope is also on the horizon for rent, as the federal government has freed money to help small businesses. And we fully expect these amounts will be spendable on fixed costs, including rent. This is all great news, as 85% of restaurant operators wanted to see the wage subsidy program continue into 2021. And going forward, Restaurants Canada will continue to actively work with government in delivering on these initiatives that will support the survival of our industry. And this ongoing financial assistance will be a vital lifeline for the majority of restaurant operators. In a survey Restaurants Canada conducted about 3 weeks ago, 63% of food service operators said their business requires additional financial support from government beyond what was currently available in order to survive. This was due to the continued sharp decline in sales, as well as to pay employees and other expenses. Another 17% said they weren't really sure or didn't know, but with the growing number of COVID-19 cases, I will expect that more restaurants will require financial assistance. Now, for those that said that they require the additional financing, this isn't just for rent or other fixed costs, but also to pay employees, to pay business taxes, to pay vendors, for PPE, and more. So a continuation of these government programs will help save restaurants from closing down and also save tens of thousands of food service jobs. And this chart shows why these programs are so important. Of those that said they require additional support, 62% of them said they will permanently close in the next 6 months if they don't receive support. So that's not 62% of all restaurants in Canada, but 62% of those that said they needed support. So we're really in a critical phase right now. Now, the restaurant industry can't rely on government support alone, especially in these uncertain times. Sometimes in a survival situation, you have to focus on self-rescue. Necessity can be the mother of all invention, and you need to choose a new path forward. So in this section, I'll talk about how restaurant operators are coming up with new ways to pivot their business to bring in more guests. Here's just one example of that creativity. So some restaurants were using mannequins to make their restaurants feel a little more full while operating at a reduced capacity. And restaurants were also strategically placing these mannequins in their establishments to help customers maintain space and socially distance. Now, I'm not saying that you have to go to this extreme, but the food service industry has to continually find new ways to pivot their business, because at this point, we really have nothing to lose. In a survey of food service operators in April and May, we found that restaurant operators quickly pivoted to contactless payment, contactless pickup, and curbside pickup. When table service restaurants had their on-premise dining closed down, a number of these operators began to offer delivery for the very first time and seeing quite a bit of success from that. This includes the delivery of alcohol for the first time. If we look just exclusively at licensed establishments, 74% of table service restaurants or restaurant bars added beverage alcohol as part of their takeout and delivery offerings. Meal kits was one of the most innovative changes made during the pandemic, as well as adding groceries. And it's interesting because over the years, we've seen a blurring of the lines between retail food and food service, with retailers moving towards a food service model with grocerants and prepared foods. Now we see that pendulum swinging in the other direction, with restaurants now offering more grocery and retail options. So food service operators can use meal kits and groceries as an opportunity to release signature dishes, sauces, or snacks through a new channel to not only improve sales, but also to boost your brand reach. Now, as part of the Angus Reid survey, we had asked Canadians to rank the most important factors in selecting a restaurant. Now, in the past, when we've asked this question, the typical response was its convenience, its value, and its craveability. And by craveability, I mean choosing a restaurant for a specific menu item the restaurant is known for. So how have things changed because of COVID-19? It was almost a tie for first, but it's interesting to note that high quality food just barely surpassed safe and clean environment as number one. So just to be clear, Canadians are not choosing high quality food over safe and clean environment. They are choosing high quality food and safe and clean environment. This was followed by value and then choosing a restaurant for a specific menu item. That's the craveability factor. So we have rising to the top of the list, high quality food and safety, but look how far down convenience is now on the list. And it's going to be interesting once there's a vaccine, if high quality food and health and safety remain the top two factors, or will Canadians return to their old habits again? But I have a hunch a lot of these are going to be here to stay. Now, throughout today's presentation, I've mentioned a lot about health and safety. So what do Canadians want to see when they go out to restaurants in terms of health and safety measures? Well, it turns out they want to see everything. Apart from socially distanced table, which was the #1 ranked item, a lot of other factors were ranked first and most important, such as staff wearing masks and gloves, socially distanced in common areas, sanitizers at every table, and you can just go right on down that list. As I said before, you need to make all your health and safety measures obvious and visible to help reassure your guests. And when it comes to health and safety, transparency has never been more important than it is now. It's also something that you can be creative with when talking to your guests. Just to give you an example, Donna Dewar from Mildred's Temple Kitchen here in Toronto has used Instagram Live to conduct cooking classes during this crisis. And this is a great way to engage with your guests and keep your brand alive. Now, in one episode, she showed how the restaurant works behind the scenes, staff wearing masks, being socially distanced, hand washing timing, and how tables are socially distanced to keep guests safe. In talking with her, she said she had just such a great response to this. So by being transparent with guests, it really shows the public what you are doing. Now, as discussed earlier in the presentation, we've seen a dramatic decline in sales. When we look at by day part, it's primarily the morning meals and lunches reporting the largest declines. With so many people working remotely, staying closer to home, not traveling as much, they aren't grabbing their morning coffee and snacks on the way to work like they used to. Now, these declines were felt at both quick and full service restaurants, although the declines in quick service restaurants are smaller than what we're seeing at full service restaurants. So start thinking about your business. It's going to be critical for you to find the best way to serve your customers in their home setting, especially in the post-COVID-19 era. For example, I'm hearing about some companies that used to cater corporate events prior to COVID-19. So they've gone from these catering events to now pivoting to cooking and delivering healthy, safe, affordable, family-style meals to people's home. So there are opportunities out there. One of the biggest trends throughout the past 6 months is the rise in delivery. Now, even before COVID-19, delivery sales had jumped by 85% between 2016 and 2019. Meanwhile, look at on-premise sales, rising just 3% during that time frame. In 2019, delivery sales grew to more than $4 billion, with $2.1 billion in sales at quick service restaurants and $2 billion in sales at full service restaurants. Now, before COVID-19, delivery sales would account for less than 10% of overall sales at restaurants. In April 2020, that share jumped to 24% of sales at quick service restaurants and 28% of sales at full service restaurants. I remember Yonge Street, just south of Bloor in Toronto, from where I live, on a Friday night in April and May, and the street would just be packed with delivery cars and delivery bikes picking up food from restaurants. And it wasn't just meals that they're picking up, but also snacks and, amazingly, a lot of bubble tea. So as a result, a greater demand for delivery. A survey of food service operators in Restaurants Canada in July found that 55% of quick service restaurants now have and go through a third-party delivery, and 49% of full service restaurants offer delivery through a third-party aggregator. Now, as indoor dining has increased just in the last few months, we've seen a bit of a pullback in the delivery market share, but it hasn't fully returned to pre-COVID-19 levels. And it's unlikely that it ever will. So the big challenge for restaurants is how to create that same consumer engagement that you had inside your restaurant and now move it to an online platform, because delivery is here to stay. And I think back to Donna's Instagram cooking classes as a great example on a way to create that engagement. One area where COVID-19 has certainly accelerated the growth in is ghost kitchens. And these are virtual kitchens with no storefront and just designed for delivery. But it helps reduce overhead and requires fewer staff. So one of the big questions, though, is would Canadians want to order from a ghost kitchen, or do they prefer to order delivery from a traditional restaurant? Again, a survey from our Canadians found that 55% said they would be interested in ordering food from a delivery from a ghost kitchen. But it's important to note this figure rises to 72% for those 18 to 34-year-olds. And again, as part of our surveys, currently just 4% of restaurant operators surveyed have and operate a ghost kitchen, but that share is expected to grow to 12% over the next 2 years. While there isn't as much interest in tech-forward delivery by older Canadians, younger consumers are certainly much more interested in trying the following. 55% of 18 to 34-year-olds said they would order restaurant delivery from a self-driving car. 50% said that they would order restaurant delivery from an automated robot. I've seen a few of these around town as well. And 48% would order restaurant delivery from a voice ordering device such as Amazon Alexa. So if you're looking to bring in a younger clientele, new technology and cutting-edge services like these could really help draw in younger diners. And remember, today's youth and young adults interact with the world with their phones. So if you want them to find you, this is where you need to be. Finally, you have control over your pricing. Right now, restaurants are expected to raise their menu prices by an average of 3.6% over the next 12 months. 20% said they will raise their menu prices by more than 5%. And because of all this economic uncertainty, another 21% or another 30% are unsure. It's interesting to note, one trend that we are seeing from some operators is that when people eat out, they're actually spending more than they did on average. They're ordering more expensive cuts of meat. They're drinking higher end alcohol. So there may be some room to increase your menu prices strategically. Now, as part of Restaurants Canada's recovery series during the summer, there was a fantastic webinar called Engineering Your Menu for Profits by the 15 Group. I can't recommend that one enough. And I'll have a link at the end of the webinar so that you can go and log on to that. It's going to be very helpful, especially if you're trying to figure out how to do pricing and what changes to make to your menu. So again, a few quick survival tips for this section. Don't compromise. Don't compromise on your service and not on your quality. You may have to change to single-ply toilet paper to save money, like we talked about in the first section, but don't skimp on the butter that makes your signature dish. We know from the Angus Reid study the importance of high-quality food. And this pandemic also provides an opportunity to reset and reprioritize the consumer with excellent service. Don't stop innovating. We see this innovation in many different ways at restaurants now, with offering delivery, alcohol delivery, meal kits, grocery stores, ghost kitchens. Now, in the last section, I talked about transparency with staff, and sometimes the best ideas for change and innovation can come from your staff. I spoke with one restaurant operator, and she said that brunch was not something that they started out with, but it certainly kept them going during the tough times, and then now it's become a brand standard for them. That idea did not come from management. That came out of staff meetings. So again, that transparency that I talked about initially, Keep talking to your staff because you're going to get some great ideas out there. Finally, if you're ever lost in the woods, you need to be able to signal for help. Have a loud whistle, bring a harmonica, something else, just so that people can find you. You need to be noisy. And for restaurants, that means you need to put the gas on marketing. Again, this doesn't have to be just traditional marketing, but also leveraging all social media platforms, such as Instagram and TikTok. So whether you're stranded in the wilderness or a restaurant operator, it's important to know, what is your food situation? And just like when you're in the wilderness, it's critically important for your survival as a restaurant operator to find the right food to put on the menu. In a survival situation, one thing you can eat with relative safety are grasshoppers and most other insects. Apparently, from Les Stroud, he says these are actually pretty good. Yet, according to a survey of Canadians, just 3% of Canadians are extremely or very interested in ordering insects from a restaurant. So what is popular on menus at restaurants? So at the beginning of 2020, 476 professional chefs participated in Restaurants Canada's 11th annual Canadian Chef Survey. And they rated a variety of menu items and cooking methods as either a hot trend or an up-and-comer. So here are the hot trends for 2020. So number one for the first time is plant-based burgers and sausages. And we've seen exponential growth in this category, especially with the huge popularity of Beyond Meat products. And as it was recently announced, the Impossible Burger is now coming to Canada. Going through the list, you can see very similar items such as meatless vegetarian entrees at number 5, plant-based proteins at number 6. So there's a lot of popularity for these items. And it's not just from vegetarians and vegans. In fact, 50% of Canadians said they are interested in trying plant-based meat alternatives. Next on the list is fermented foods, which includes tempeh, miso, and kimchi. So we've gone from sort of that new world plant-based over to old world cooking and preservation methods. And just rounding out the top 3 is food smoking. So this includes smoking meat, but also smoking of vegetables and cheese. Now, of course, the survey was conducted before COVID-19, so we reached out to a number of chefs to ask, are any of these trends really still valid, or has the world changed since then? A lot of chefs said that zero waste cooking now rises to the top as it has the potential to help reduce both food and labor costs. And as stated earlier, we are seeing a focus on downsizing menu complexity, maximizing each ingredient to increase efficiency. So zero waste cooking can help eliminate waste as well as maximize profits. So what about the up-and-comers? For the first time, plant-based desserts showed up as the #1 up-and-comer. Chefs can be very creative by using alternative ingredients like tahini, coconut oil, pumpkin puree, and flaxseed instead of butter and eggs to create a unique texture and flavor. Plus, there's the added benefit of more fiber and less sugar, so it'd be healthier as well. It's really interesting and exciting to see some of the combinations you can explore, such as beet and chocolate, cauliflower and caramelized white chocolate, pumpkin and yogurt. Number 3 on the list, charcuterie, which is new on the list, an alternative to the usual meat charcuterie plates, but this time just using seafood. Once again on the list, we see food and waste reduction. It's interesting as well to know that vegetable carb substitutes is new to the list at number 10. And we're already seeing some of this being tested on menus. I know over the summer, Chipotle was testing a cilantro lime cauliflower rice at some of the restaurants. So this could become the next hot trend at restaurants. Now, prior to the crisis, the sale of alcoholic beverages accounted for 20% of revenue at full-service restaurants and 67% of revenue at drinking places. But one of the biggest trends we've seen in the food service industry in recent years is that decline in alcohol orders from young people. So just looking at the chart, 27% of young people between the legal drinking age and 24 ordered an alcoholic beverage at a bar. That number has dropped to just 10%. So we've seen fewer younger people going out to drink, and when they do, they're going out less often. And this has been especially true among young men. One of the key trends of 2019 that will carry forward into 2020 and beyond is the loss of market share of alcohol volume at bars. It's likely this is due to the growth in the cannabis industry. Cannabis use is highest among young males, and it seems to motivate them to stay at home. And so the big challenge for bars is drawing people out more when they would rather stay at home. Looking to the future, 23% of Canadians said they are interested in trying lab-grown meat. This so-called motherless meat or clean meat is stem cells taken from animal muscle tissue and grown in vitro. It's ethical, it uses less water, less land, and it's not as energy intensive. And every year we're getting one step closer, with some estimates that we could see it on store shelves as early as 2022. And we could start seeing it on menus as well. I'm hearing about some larger chains that are currently testing lab-grown meat using 3D printing technology. So we're living in very interesting times here. So again, some survival tips for this section. Canadians continue to be mindful about the environment. Some of the most popular menu trends focus on plant-based, eating less meat, zero waste, and eco-friendly packaging. And this is changing menus across the country. Second, our chef survey also found that claims involving house-made, locally sourced, free-range, sustainability have maintained their popularity and recognition both among guests as well as chefs. And finally, food waste reduction is an area that we cannot be overemphasized enough in terms of importance. Especially during these challenging times, keeping track and monitoring food waste is critical to understanding how well you're doing from week to week. It also forces chefs to get creative with their menu. And by utilizing an ingredient in multiple recipes, it's another way to reduce waste and save money. If you're ever lost or injured in the wilderness, it's generally a good idea to create a safe and warm camp and wait for help to arrive, especially because weather conditions can change so rapidly. Likewise, your restaurant needs to prepare for what is coming. So this last section, I'm going to focus on our latest forecast for food service sales. We're certainly in uncharted waters when it comes to economic forecasting. Last year, we were forecasting that commercial food service sales would increase by 3.8% to $77.4 billion in 2020. Now this figure is just commercial food service sales, so restaurants, caterers, and bars, and it excludes the non-commercial food service industry. Now, given this uncertainty, Restaurants Canada released an initial forecast in May, which provided 3 possible forecasts for food service sales. All the percentages here show the decline in sales in 2020 compared to 2019. Now, scenario 1 was the most optimistic, where pent-up consumer demand would lead to a faster recovery in food service sales. And in this scenario, annual sales would decline by about 24% in 2020 compared to 2019. In the second scenario, consumers would be much more cautious about returning to restaurants and bars once containment measures are lifted, and here sales are forecast to decline by about 37%. Finally, in our most pessimistic scenario was scenario 3, where consumers are reluctant to dine out at food service establishments. As a result, the decline in food service sales is forecast to be 48.4% in 2020 over 2019. Now, based on data from Statistics Canada, we are now trending right in the middle of scenarios 1 and 2. However, if we see a significant lockdown across the country, then that annual decline in sales would be then somewhere between scenarios 2 and 3. So about a month ago, we released an updated forecast for commercial food service sales by segment for the remainder of 2020 that goes to 2022. Now, the blue line is where we expected food service sales to be from our forecast last year. And again, this excludes the non-commercial food service segment. Based on the latest Statistics Canada data, some other internal analysis that we've done, we now are forecasting that commercial food service sales in 2020 will decline by 30.8%. So again, halfway between scenarios 1 and scenarios 2 from the previous slide. In 2021, commercial food service sales are forecast to bounce back with a 31.6% increase, but annual sales will remain below COVID-19 levels, pre-COVID-19 levels. It's not until 2022 that sales will return back to 2019 levels. So what does this mean for the various segments? Well, with quick service restaurant sales are forecast to decrease by 13% in 2020 compared to 2019. And because they didn't see as much of a decline, they're forecast to return to pre-COVID levels much faster in 2021. In contrast, sales at full service restaurants are forecast to fall by 42.5% in 2020 and won't return to pre-COVID levels until sometime in 2022. And this is largely due to the decline in tourists, drop-off in business dining, and some consumers being reluctant to dine in, as we saw before. In fact, as part of our Angus Reid survey, we asked how long it would be before Canadians feel comfortable going back to a table service restaurant with friends and family on a regular basis. And 31% said, you know what, I'm comfortable now. But that number isn't going to climb much higher over the remainder of 2020. And even by the first half of 2021, 46% of Canadians said they would be comfortable going out to a table service restaurant. On the other hand, 1/4 of Canadians said they're going to wait for a vaccine, and 21% said they are not sure. So half of Canadians don't know when they will go back out or wait till there's a vaccine. So it's going to be a long road to recovery, and table service restaurants will really need to focus on takeout and delivery in the meantime. For caterers and drinking places, both have been so hard hit by COVID-19, and it certainly will take a lot longer for them to return to pre-COVID levels. In 2020, we are forecasting that caterer sales will fall by more than 50%, and sales at drinking places will fall by nearly 57%. Now, it's important to note that these forecasts depend on several critical assumptions. Most importantly, that coronavirus vaccinations will begin in early 2021. And once an effective vaccine is found, pent-up demand will boost domestic spending and international travel. The office workers and businesses in the downtown core will return to some sort of a new normal. However, if we see a delay in finding an effective vaccine, that would significantly lengthen the recovery time for the food service industry. In addition, this forecast also assumes there will be no further additional national lockdowns, like what we saw in April. If we see another major lockdown like that, it's just going to have a devastating impact on food service operators, and many operators are not going to survive. So at the beginning of today's presentation, I talked about the analogy that the food service industry had basically fallen off a cliff. We were a $93 billion industry dedicated to serving millions of people every day, and COVID-19 has pushed the industry to the brink of collapse. Much like this rock climber, many food service operators I know of are just holding on for dear life and trying to climb their way out of this. There is hope. In the past 6 months, we've seen restaurants pivot to try and adapt to this situation. Whether it's meal kits, grocery, delivery, ghost kitchens, new menu items, there are opportunities to be found. Not only that, we will need continued government support to get back on our feet. One thing that I've learned over the past 20 years in the food service industry is that operators are incredible innovators. I know you're in the fight for your life right now to stay afloat, but with sheer will and determination, we will emerge as a better and a stronger industry. Don't doubt that. It will be a different industry, and I'm not sure anyone can say for certain what this will look like. But one day we're going to be back on that mountaintop, and it'll be a new beginning, and there'll be a new normal. We will survive and succeed, and Restaurants Canada is with you through all this. And as part of that survival kit, call us for any questions that you have on GR-related, government relations stuff, and we also have a wide variety of research. We have the Foodservice Facts, and in many of these reports, we have business insights from some of the brightest minds in the industry to help you pivot and understand some of the challenges they're facing. And once again, just remind you, there's a fantastic rapid recovery series. I believe there was 10 to 12 different webinars that were out there, all very valuable information. Here's the one on menu pricing and menu engineering. So I'll let you take a screenshot of that. And for there, happy to open up the floor to any questions that you might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I think, that gave us a really good rundown of what happened, what the expectations are, and, a lot of different scenarios that you've planted out there. Wondering if you have it handy, any specific region specific, if we were to go Western, Central, and Canada in terms of whether, forthcoming declines or increases overall.
Not handy with me. We're going to be producing a long-term forecast in the next, I would say, month or so that will break out those regional changes. But what we've seen just in the data, provinces like Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, the provinces that seem to have the highest number of COVID-19 cases generally seem to be hit the hardest. I look at numbers in Saskatchewan, and some of the numbers, there's still declines there, but certainly the declines are much smaller there than they are in other parts of the country. So there are these regional differences, and it really depends on almost like population density, but in terms of the number of COVID-19 cases, as well as if they have to rely heavily on tourism. But we'll certainly have a much more firm answer in the coming months.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you so much. And we'll definitely get that out. So be sure to sign up for any email updates, and you will see that through our email communication there. One of the questions is percentage of operators that, when you mentioned menu increases, the percentage of operators, are many of them just, increasing their menu prices above normal just to cover that PPE cost?
It is. They're trying to gain back a little bit of that money that they've lost because they're still they're in a mammoth amount of debt at this point. So part of that strategy is increasing menu prices. The other thing is, and I've seen this at a lot of restaurants, they're only open at 50% capacity. They have to make up for that somehow. And so again, if you're strategically increasing your menu prices, I think people become understanding about that. Especially if operators are in reduced capacity. So it's going to be different depending on the segments, and operators are really going to have to determine what is in the local environment and how much they can possibly raise menu prices.
And I think you're right. And going back to the menu engineering, you can visit restaurantscanada.org/rapid recovery, and there's still quite a number of relevant information and webinars that were hosted only a couple of months ago there that you can see, including the one that Chris, you referenced, the menu engineering. But you also talked about transparency. And transparency being key. And I thought that was, that became very apparent early on, and it still is. I think in gaining back consumer confidence, consumers want to see specifically what restaurants are doing. And I love that behind the scenes look.
Yeah, and I think that's just an example of operators just trying to use it. What Donna did, I think, was fantastic because it's not high tech. It's simple, but it's an opportunity to reach out to people and really get your voice heard, show what you're doing, and it just shows some of the personality behind that. So I'd recommend anybody that's on this call watch it and sort of see how they do things. And it's just, again, a fantastic way to pivot in this new world.
We talk about all the different things that a restaurant can do, Chris, but what about the role of suppliers and distributors in their recovery? I know, we've been either shortening the supply chain, making our menus a little smaller. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen, and I think it's going to stick around for a while, even into 2022, is a reduced number of items on menus. I think the sort of approach of casting the widest net to bring in everybody that you can, I think operators are going to change that model. They're going to go more specific towards, we're going to focus on 5 or 6 key menu ingredients or dishes, and they can work with the suppliers and the producers to try and come up with what's the best plan for that. One thing that really is big in the industry, and we've seen this throughout this whole crisis, is the idea of local. And I've heard in Alberta, and I think it's called Restaurants on a Plate or Chefs on a Plate, but what it is chefs working with farmers to promote local. And this is a great way to come up, to talk with your local farmers or suppliers and producers and find new innovative ways that you can use a product that you might not have thought about before. So one of the things that's come out of this industry, unlike anything else, is how willing the whole industry is willing to work together. Everybody has come to us, and suppliers and the manufacturers and producers and suppliers and restaurants just saying, how can we help each other? And so there is that willingness to help. And I think just reach out to some of your suppliers, your distributors, talk to your local farmers. I'm sure they've got some great ideas as well on how you can use product that you haven't done in a different way.
Yeah, and especially, when we talk about going into the winter months and the bounty, if you will, of Canada, I think there could be some concerns around that, but there's still a lot that can be offered, especially considering you may have to consider what may be more of a seasonal menu.
And I think this really speaks to one of the big changes that has to happen in the industry is that flexibility. I think before it was a little bit more on the rigid side, where now we have to find a way to be flexible and scalable so that we can operate and still make a profit if we're open at 50% capacity, 75% capacity, 90% capacity. And it's the same with menus. You have to have that flexibility because labor shortages, food shortages, all of that is going to continue to go forward, and that's going to have a direct impact on your business. So having that flexibility, having that scalability is going to be very critical going forward.
So another question in regards to, you mentioned that there's a rent program, that there's details coming out, I believe very shortly now. We do have David Lefebvre, our Vice President of Federal and Quebec on the line. David, I'd like to ask you, can you give us any details or clarify anything on the rent program specifically?
Yes, so thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Chris, for a very enlightening presentation. So if I can make this point about the government program on rent, as a lot of you on the call know so far, it's been a real frustration that the first federal program has basically given a veto to the landlords that they need to do the thing and they need to enter into a deal with their tenant before you can be eligible for some help about rent. So we've advocated over the summer and in the spring a lot to the federal government to change that. And now the announcement that the Prime Minister made last Friday is that there's going to be some support to pay for the fixed cost, that it's not going to be under the same program. It's going to be through the regional agencies, which is a different thing. And you will not have to go through the landlord to be able to access the funds. There's still going to be some eligibility question. We're still awaiting the kind of amount that would be unveiled. They say the global program would be around $600 million for food service, but also for other industries. So we should have other details during this week or early next week. But so far, it's encouraging to see that it's not going to be the same program that has been, it's been a broken program. And when we look at the number, like the number that Chris presented, I think only 37 or 38% of you thought that this program was going, to be helpful. So we heard you, and we're working for government to make it better in terms of the fixed cost. So that would be my answer. So far so good. Let's keep looking for the details, and hopefully we're going to be able to announce good news over the next few months.
No, that's great, David. Thank you so much. And, I just want to thank your team, the entire GR team, for consistently being at the table, both federally and provincially, to help us help food service operators navigate the situation with favorable government action. So that's great. Keep up the phenomenal work. Chris, back to you. We have seen, you mentioned some rising cases in more of the city centers. Do we know what the performance of restaurants is like in more suburban areas and smaller towns versus larger areas and larger downtown cores, for example?
Yeah, that's a number that I would love to have. Unfortunately, it's just the way that the data is collected from Statistics Canada. They just look at it from a provincial level. We are probably going to be, in the next couple of weeks, just in order to track what's been happening, doing some additional surveys just to try and identify what's happening in different marketplaces. And that could be an opportunity to go into some of the smaller marketplaces just to see what's happening there. I think it really depends, and especially a lot of operators would know this over the summers. If you're a small community but you rely heavily on tourism, that's going to have a dramatic impact on your sales. And especially if you're in a small community, you just basically have the local environment to work with. So it's numbers that I'm hoping that we can get, but currently we just don't.
No, that's perfect. But listen, we're just approaching the top of the hour, so I do want to give people a minute or so they can get to their next event, or phone call or Zoom call if you're working from home. But Chris, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Everyone who took the time to be with us today, I really do appreciate it. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to us, and maybe we didn't get to a question that you had today, we have various different ways you can reach out to us. So if we can just quickly go to the next slide, you can reach out to us on whether it be through our social media channels, email, phone. Don't hesitate. We are here for you. We're here to help. So once again, Chris, thank you so much for your insights, and for everyone that tuned in. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day.